All right, so welcome to the Introspection podcast, episode 1. Today I have with me Mary Dwyer, my sibling, and a counselling psychologist. So welcome to the podcast, Mary.
Thank you, Sean. It's good to be here.
Okay, good to see you too. So just wondering if maybe we'll just start off with begin with the influences that made you who you are today. Maybe just walk through maybe your path or your journey for me, and
Okay.
maybe we'll take it from there. Is that okay?
That's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
So I guess my main influences in my life were our father, who kind of reared us most of the time, as our mother died when we were young. But also I have to include our grandfather, because he was a big part of our lives as well. And in a recent piece of work that I did, I actually dove a little bit deeper into his life and his ways. And what really struck me was his independence of spirit and his ability to follow his own dreams, his own goals, and not to be influenced too much by other people. So I guess he fought in the First World War. He was involved in giving out pensions to British Legion ex-army people in the town at a time when perhaps that wasn't the most popular thing to be doing. And rumour has it that he had to leave his native Cork for the same reason, that he had been involved with the British Army, and that was seen as just not nationalistic enough and not acceptable. So I guess his way of being and the stories I've heard about him and my own experience of him, as I get older, I'm more appreciative of him, but I realise how much he influenced me to be my own person.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because obviously the same as that, I would have known him as a child and would have taken me fishing and stuff like that. And your grandparents always have a little bit more time for you maybe than your parents do, because they're out busy earning a living and doing all that sort of stuff. And
That's
your
right.
grandparent is maybe around a little bit more.
Yes.
So just for a bit of background, I suppose, we're based in Ireland, and a lot of Irish guys would have fought in the First World War with the British Army at a time when the country was struggling for its independence, Southern Ireland.
Right.
So
Yes.
a lot of Irish guys would have been conflicted, and the society itself was conflicted. So it was a difficult time. I remember our grandfather saying that, when he was fighting in the First World War, he was regarded as an Irish guy, a paddy or whatever. And when he came back, he was regarded as a Brit because he fought with the Brits. So he felt
Yes.
a bit of an outsider in both situations. So
Mm-hmm.
I think, as a family, we kind of have an independent streak. And maybe
Yes.
that's, we can see a little bit of our granddad in ourselves as well. Would you feel that?
Absolutely. I would. And I've heard stories of how he used to, show affection to our grandmother, who died before we were born, unfortunately. But out, as he was leaving for work, he worked as postmaster later in life in our town where we grew up. And stories were that, they would kiss each other at the gate when saying goodbye, which was not a done thing in Ireland at that time. It would be frowned upon, these public displays of affection. And again, I love these stories because I love the fact that they did what they wanted to do, and how natural and how absolutely lovely it is to have been doing that. Also, there is a poem that our grandmother wrote to our mother, which I have really held very dear. And the poem goes, "Whatever you are, be that. Whatever you say, be true. Be constant in fact, straightforwardly act. Be nobody else but you."
Yes,
And
it's
that,
interesting. I suppose, you and I and other members of the family, we've often felt constrained maybe in very structured environments or whatever, and we're more, I suppose, free-spirited and entrepreneurial, or, we like to follow our own interests. And
yes, I think so, yes.
that's obviously coming down along the timeline through the
Certainly is,
generations.
yes. And it was interesting, when it came to our own father, then that's another influence for me, was when we were growing up, he was quite free-spirited in very difficult times, rearing 5 children on his own and with very little money, and his own difficulties, which he had. So it left us with kind of a tough time. But within that, we had these lovely holidays we went on when nobody went on holidays. Somehow he made that happen. And we were a raggle-taggle bunch, you know, and we sort of lived out on sort of the edge of society, but in it as well. We were very much part of the community. We were involved in lots of things and had lots of friends and neighbours. But we also didn't have some of the, I suppose, the constraints that some of our friends would have had in more orderly households where, you know, you were expected to be certain places at certain times. But yet our dad always gave us a sense of who we were, and certainly good values, I think, you know. So one thing that I do recall very, very much so, and I really think it has influenced my choice of career, is our father chatting to men who were struggling to overcome alcohol addiction in our kitchen. And this would be a regular occurrence. They'd be sitting one side of the range and the other, having coffee and cigarettes and discussing their issues. And we as children, at least I remember, not being that interested in the story, not certainly wanting to sit down and listen to it at all, but also picking up that open door, that compassionate listening, that willingness to spend time with people who were in trouble. And our own dad had his own struggles with alcohol addiction as well. So he knew what this was like. And he was prepared to give his time to help other people. And I think that really influenced me a lot in terms of how maybe I could help other people too. So that was quite a big influence.
I see. And again, just for a little bit of background, our mother would have died at a very young age, around 36, with leukemia, leaving her dad with 5 young children at a time when there was very little welfare in the country, and guys just had to kind of suck it up and get on with it, which he did. But, you know, given the struggles that he had and the difficulties in his life, he would have turned to alcohol and, you know, had his own problems there, subsequently gave it up. And as Mary has indicated, you know, spent a lot of time talking to other guys who were struggling with alcohol addiction, and they helping him and him helping them. But yes, a regular conversation at home in the household. And I suppose, yeah, there was an ethos there of, you know, trying to help others and trying to support other people, particularly people who are maybe on the margins or having, you know, difficulties in their lives. And we knew a lot of those guys intimately because it was a small house and they spent a lot of time there. And we would, to this day, regard them as our friends, you know, those guys that came in and out. But a very different time and an era where, you know, there were far less supports out there and people maybe relied on each other an awful lot more. So you've gone along and you've taken up some of that and, you know, probably unconsciously absorbed it and brought it into your own life as you went forward yourself,
Yes.
your own struggles and your own desire to help others and do something similar.
Yes, I think one of the things that when we were young and leaving school, we were encouraged to get good pensionable jobs, as a lot of young people were at that time. And we all went, some of us went that route actually. And for a while that was great because it gave us a stability, you know, it gave us an income, it kind of gave us something to focus on, because I think part of our upbringing sort of left us with some unanswered questions or areas that we weren't too sure about. So in terms of emotionally how we were. So I think that for me, it provided a sense of containment and friendships. And I joined the Midland Health Board. I was in the civil service for a year and worked up in Dublin and in Portlaoise. But it was at the time when, at that time in the 70s, this is the 78, I joined the civil service when Charlie Haughey was our Taoiseach, and he was creating jobs in the civil service at the time. I think, I may be wrong in this, but I think maybe to reduce the unemployment numbers, but I'm not sure that the work was there. So I do remember being in Dublin doing tasks that I felt really disappointed in, because we had done our leaving cert, we'd kind of worked hard and got a reasonable leaving cert, and here I was putting things into a numerical order, for example, and going, what is the point of this job? So, but when I got to the Midland Health Board, I got an opportunity to do lots of different things, and I worked in finance, I worked in personnel as it was then, HR as it is now, the CEO's office, and looking after the board members. So I kind of went for promotions when I got them, and But all the while I was really finding that I wanted to do something else, and psychology always drew me to it. And there's one big memory I do have of going to the library with our dad, the local library, which I used to do often because I loved hanging out with him. And at that time, the library was such a quiet place. You couldn't sneeze nearly in it. It was very, very quiet. But I remember picking up a book called Sybil, and it was in the social sciences section where Dad used to always go to pick up books himself. And I brought it home and I read it. And it was the story of what was a multiple personality disorder, as it was called then. It has a different name now. But I was fascinated, absolutely fascinated, that this person within their own psyche could have all these different personalities in order to survive from trauma. And I think I never forgot that book. So when an opportunity finally arose for me, as I was married now with 3 children and working full time, still wanting to study, but the Open University became available to Southern Ireland in 1992. And I was one of the first to sign up for psychology, which I was able to do part-time over a 6-year period. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it from the beginning. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so you went from taking the good, secure job, the secure environment that I suppose in a situation where we were in a young country that had its own difficulties and maybe a shortage of capital and, not much going on. There was a desire to find something safe so that you could basically survive and eke out a living here. And then on the other hand, you had the government trying to provide jobs by creating jobs that essentially weren't real, probably poorly paying and, unfulfilling jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately getting a bit of experience then in the health service, working with, the CEO, which was a good insight into how, a big scale operation really operates, and, it was valuable learning. But all the time thinking about, yes, this early influence of seeing this Sybil, the psychology book, and that you maybe found echoes of it in your own life perhaps, or that it was something that really interested you and you'd like to pursue further. Subsequently,
I think it was very, I beg your pardon. Sorry, Sean, I disturbed you there.
No, you're fine. So yeah, it's interesting. So you have a journey, you have a life's journey there, but you're trying to negotiate that life's journey within the constraints that are around, and probably a common situation that would be harder for young people to maybe recognize today when there are more opportunities available and maybe easier to access. Having said that, they have their own issues and their different issues. But at that time, life was constrained on a level, and you did what you could when you could, and you pushed out the boats. So you finally got the opportunity then to maybe develop that early interest, and that would be a big shift in your life from how it was currently progressing.
Yes.
To move over to
Well, I was very fortunate to be in the health service where I was. And at the time I began to study, I was in the HR personnel department, and I was supported to do my studies. I made a case as to why I should be supported, and it was granted. So they supported me financially and with time off to study, which was something that was very, very welcome and unusual at the time. So I'd have to acknowledge that I was fortunate to be where I was. And so one of the things that I did then when I studied was I met a group of other people who were doing the same thing, and we're firm friends to today, and we used to help each other to study. And that, I think, helped us all to do much better than we might have done had we been studying alone. So once I received the degree in psychology, I really hadn't thought any further. To me, the psychology degree wasn't really about obtaining a degree. It all looks like it was a plan when you look back, I think, on life. And I think that's the strange thing about it, is you kind of follow this urge or this need or whatever it is, and it lands you somewhere. So I now had a degree in psychology, which was kind of like the icing on the cake, but certainly not the reason I was studying it. I was studying for the love of it. And I remember at the time it was unusual for people to be studying at night. It was really unusual. And I remember people saying to me, you're studying? Why are you studying? Well, because I like the subject. And how long is it going to take you to do it? It's going to take 6 years. What? It was inconceivable at that time for somebody to do that. So I couldn't really, you know, there were a few people who really got it, you know, but anyway, it didn't bother me at all. And then I'd say about a year after I had the degree, I began to think, gosh, could I do a bit more with this? You know, maybe I could go a step further. So I had a look around and I tried to see what next opportunities there would be. And I had a few false starts, but in the end, I found Trinity were running the Counselling Psychology course, which was a master's course over 2 years. And at that time, I was now working in the CEO's office. And I came up with an offer for him and for the health service, which was if they funded me to do this training, I would set up their employee assistance service because they didn't have one at the time. And I had already become involved in this service called the Critical Incident Stress Management Service, thanks to the HR manager who was my big support throughout all of this. So I was already beginning to move into that area of staff support, staff welfare, helping them overcome trauma. So I put my case to the CEO that this was what I was prepared to do should they fund me to do it. Now at this stage I hadn't even applied. So he sort of said, okay, well sure, apply anyway, which I did. And to be honest, Sean, in the application, these things sound, look, in retrospect, that they all ran smoothly. It was extremely difficult for me to get that application done because the type of application it was the type of discussion we're having now. So it was very much about reflecting on myself as a person, being able to answer questions that were not just academic ones. And I struggled with that. I hadn't really been doing a lot of that at that time in my life. So I remember having to kind of haul in a few friends, write out something and say, is that it? And they'd say, no, you're not there yet. And have to keep redrafting. It literally went to the wire before I could get the application in. But when it went in, I kind of knew it was almost because it was last minute, I was forced to be more authentic, more real, dig a bit deeper. So I had a couple of interviews to do in Trinity College, group and personal interview. And then I did ask the CEO for help with that, which he advised me about not jumping in the group too soon. So I got a lot of help and support. And I achieved the place, which I was delighted about. And the day I achieved the place, I was sitting in front of the lady who was telling me I was in, because it was 12 places for the country. So it was very few places. And behind her was that quote that is often associated with Nelson Mandela, but was written by Marianne Williamson about our light. It's not our darkness we're afraid of, it's our light. And I just read it and I thought, wow, this is a moment I'll never forget, that I've actually got here against all the odds, a mother of 3 children out in the Midlands, you know, having gotten this far. But it was more about the excitement of going to college, really, the excitement of having time to study, be part of, you know, not just at night squeezing it in, but actually being able to luxuriate in it almost in college.
So you've got this internal desire that's going on inside you, and you manage to find an outlet for it in a situation where it's barely possible or even thinkable. You get a lot of incredulity or negativity around from friends or whatever. You're not fazed by that, which is impressive in itself, because often, you know, people feel constrained by what's going on around. So, and you manage to pursue your dream and get through it. But then when you get there, you're faced with having to do this introspection, which I'm guessing that a lot of people that get into psychology, they start off with maybe working through maybe some issues they have themselves, develop that interest, and then go on to help others and, you know, look at it like that. So tell me about maybe just being able to do that introspection, or the journey that, you know, walk me through how you navigated that particular issue, which seems to be a little bit problematic, maybe I'm picking up.
Yes, I think I had some experience of going to see a counsellor prior to that when I was around in my early 30s. So it's not that I had no experience of beginning to reflect on myself and become more self-aware, because I had. And I was struggling with my own experience of being a mother and how to do that, having lacked the modeling of our own mother as we grew up, as I was only 4 when she died and you were even younger. So there were issues coming up for me around that, and I went for help with that in my early 30s, and I found that it ignited a whole lot of feelings that I didn't know I had. And I was actually became aware of how when we grew up, we were, at least I'll talk about myself, I was more disconnected, not just from my feelings, but from my body even. There was a sense of, in order to survive as children, there was lots of things that I didn't even notice. So if somebody said, "Were you cold? Are you hot?" I wouldn't even be able to say for sure how my body was. And I felt the same about emotions. So I had done a little bit of training prior to going to Trinity in counselling couples. And so again, we had done a lot of personal work there. So when I was ready to go into Trinity, you would think that I would have had enough experience by then to be able to articulate the kind of questions they were asking me. But I think I was only fledgling really still. I think I was beginning to open up, but I wasn't sure still how to do that. And as part of the counselling psychology degree, now it's not the case with all psychologists, all different types of training, but with our training, it was essential that you attend for your own therapy throughout the training. So, and we had group work as well to do within the training. So it was very, very focused, which I liked, on your own process and understanding yourself. Because if we're going to work with other people and you don't actually know what you're going through yourself, you're going to impede the work. You're actually going to interfere with it. And you're going to put your stuff, for the want of a better word, onto your client. You might be reactive to them, or you might be affected by them in some way and act that out, rather than knowing, oh, I'm being affected here, so that's my stuff. I just need to park that for now and stay with the client. Without that self-understanding, I think you're not going to be as effective a therapist as you would like to be, or as a psychologist. So throughout that, we were brought through a lot of our own stuff, very painfully at times. And in the group, there were times when we'd all, the 12 of us, sit and stare at the floor for an hour because we couldn't begin the process of speaking anything authentically because we were afraid. So we met all that fears within ourselves as well. And the projection onto the other people, oh, if it wasn't for him now, I'd be better than this, or, you know, look at the way that person's reacting, all that kind of stuff that we all do all the time. But when you're in that hotbed or a hothouse of training, it's so obvious, you can't miss it. You can't pretend, you know, that you're not feeling this, whatever this is. And I think maybe because of prohibitions or maybe limitations that I would have experienced through the Catholic Church teachings and the way we were taught, it kind of opened me up a bit more to being a little bit more real, because I would have been quite self-critical and afraid to say what I was really feeling in case it wasn't good, in case it wasn't right. Whereas, you know, I became more able to go, I'm a human being like every other. I have all the same emotions that every other human being has. And I need to know what they are so that I can actually manage them and understand them and see what's the wisest thing to do in situations. So I think the course was really helpful, but not easy in going through that. But I really think that when I suppose when I graduated and began to set up the service that I had said I would do, it's only really then that it began to deepen, when I began to work in earnest. Because there is a book written, I can't think of the guy, but it's called Unlearning from the Patient. You learn from every human being you meet, and it's very, very humbling. So it's not an expert novice relationship. It's actually an equalized relationship, where the person has the same capacity as I do to manage their problems. And I'm just going to try and help them to find that capacity within themselves. So, you know, I might have a little bit more knowledge. I might be able to direct them to a certain piece of information that might be helpful, or a support situation. But essentially, I'm not better or more than they are. I'm the same.
Okay, so it's a kind of a peer-to-peer relationship, and I suppose perhaps in some ways takes place of maybe friendships when people are maybe a little bit more isolated in the modern world with technology and everything else. The bit you talked about there about being in touch with your own body, your own feelings,
Mm.
and you need to basically access that to as a prerequisite to being able to associate with the feelings of others and really understand and empathize with them, or even to be available to others. So it
Yeah.
seems there that perhaps a little part of yourself in the early days may have been shut down. And have you thought about that and maybe how that came about, or why maybe perhaps that was an issue for you?
Yes, I have thought about that a good bit over the years, and I think it's an evolving thing that there's always layers to. But I think one of the things that has shown me a lot in recent years is my own granddaughter, the older of my two granddaughters, is similar in her personality to me. And as a child, I would have been quite anxious and quite plugged into our father, because I would have been very aware if he wasn't okay, which some of the time he wasn't. He was struggling and under a lot of pressure, doing his best. But as a child, I would have watched him keenly for any change in his demeanor or his mood. And, I would have been anxious when he was anxious. I would have plugged into that. And there's a term for that, codependency, they call it. And I would have been aware of how once you become plugged into another human being like that at an early age, it's hard for you to know what your needs are anymore. You're so focused on the other person's needs, and if they're okay, you're okay, but if they're not, you're not. So there's that independence of who you are becomes blurred, and you're kind of sacrifice and abandon yourself a bit because of that. And it's traumatic because there isn't a place to go with that. You don't even know what that is, actually. So I have an understanding now of what that child me, if you like, went through. But when she was that small, she didn't know. So I think knowing what I know now psychologically, children do what they can to survive. And that means, if that means becoming somebody that feels I don't have many needs, well, that's what that happens with them. That helps them to get through. But later on in life, it becomes a problem, obviously, if you don't know what your needs are, and if you don't know what your feelings are, and if you don't know what you want. So definitely, I would have seen how my life choices were made at times when I didn't really know what I was doing half the time. And I think that wouldn't be unusual. I think that's for a lot of people, that is the case. So it's fortunate or unfortunate where you land in sometimes, because of that. But I see my oldest grandchild, and I see her in how she can become anxious about things and what she needs to support her when that happens. And I'm really aware of it. And I think of her and I remember me at that age. And I think she has a lot of supports around her. And I feel particularly close to her at times when she's kind of worrying, because I know what to do to help her, because I know what it's like to be there. So, but we didn't have that, unfortunately, growing up. We didn't have that person or persons to watch for our emotional well-being. So I think that is, it tends to have a lifelong effect. And I definitely think it has had a lifelong effect. And I'm not saying that as a disability of sorts, but I kind of do see it as something that can be a gift if you can use it to actually connect with other people. But it has definitely, I would say, limited my capacity to reach potential in certain areas. I would certainly say that. Yeah.
Okay, so as a child, your emotions were inherently tied in with those of your dad. Your mother was no longer around. You had siblings such as myself who were probably mostly younger and
Yes.
probably fairly obnoxious at that time. And so you're trying to deal with all of this, and maybe you were parentified a little bit. Would that be fair to say, that you were given maybe more responsibility than a
Yeah.
small child should be expected to bear or should ever have to bear? And
Well, definitely, I
along
know
with
that.
that, you're in a
Yeah.
situation where your own emotions, your own needs take second place to maybe keeping this dysfunctional adult at some level functioning, and that's a responsibility that you have, takes precedence over your own needs. So that's kind of where this, I suppose, not acknowledging your own needs maybe started. Would that be fair to say?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I do know that our dad, he would have expected me to keep the house running and, you know, do the women's stuff. He was very modern in loads of ways, but around these things, he was quite traditional. And so, you know, it was my responsibility to get the groceries or to cook something or whatever, just to try and keep on top of things. And of course, as a child, I could never keep on top of things because, you know, something broke. You might remember this. It wasn't fixed. I mean, it turned out that you were actually my only sibling that knew how to fix things in the end, because we weren't very good at that. None of us, none of the rest of us. But so I do remember one time deciding that I would wallpaper the hall as a way to try and make the place a little bit nice. Now, you know yourself, Sean, that would have been one tiny drop in the whole scene. But anyway, finally got around to getting agreement to get some wallpaper, and I began to put it on the hall wall. And after about 3 strips went up, I realized there's a whole stairs and landing here. Actually, if I keep going around here, I'm going to reach this place where I can't actually get to. And I became completely disheartened, and I left it at that. I couldn't do any more. I just met the wall. So that's just one example of times when, you know, there was nobody to say, hold on, we'll get a ladder, and, you know, I'll give you a hand, and, you know, we'll find a way. There was sort of no way. So I think the impact, yes, of being brought into the adult world too soon, having to carry responsibilities that a child really is not responsible for their parent. They can't possibly make them better. They can't make them happy. You know, they'll do their best, they'll try, but God, you know, they just don't have whatever it takes. And in fact, it's the adult's own responsibility to do that. So, but the child will do whatever they can. And I suppose, yes, that is one of the things that I would have carried throughout my life. And even to today, you know, I know it, I understand it, but I would find that I need to be careful sometimes to remember to put my own needs in the mix when decisions are being made about anything, really.
Okay, and would this extend to a form of maybe agreeableness, that you wanted to maybe not rock the boat so much, to be the one that's always helpful, maybe always in control, supportive, and maybe less inclined to maybe stand up for yourself and, you know, outline those things? That there seems to be a kind of a pattern there like that.
Yeah, I think I would have been quite the people pleaser and, you know, manipulate situations in the way that people wouldn't attack me verbally or in any way. So I would read people, and maybe that's why I can do the psychology now. I would read situations very well, and I would know how to keep myself safe. And that would be, you know, I'm saying it now as if I planned it consciously. It wouldn't be conscious at all when I was younger, but I knew how to make things work for me. And yet I would not be comfortable being in the middle or being the person to lead out, even though I know now I do have leadership qualities, but then it would be excruciatingly painful to be stepping out too much. Even though I did in an acting way and in a musical way, I definitely loved that. But that felt like I was inhabiting another person, if you know what I mean. It allowed me to escape from Mary for a while and be on stage and do something different. And I loved that. But I think, yes, there was an agreeableness. But I know that in that agreeableness and that desire not to offend anybody and to be helpful is certainly still part of who I am. And I don't see that as a negative thing, actually. I see it as a good thing once it's balanced with taking care of my own needs. But I certainly think I would have said yes a lot of the time during my life when I needed to say no. Or I mightn't have really thought about it in terms of, well, can I say yes here? What's it going to cost me to say yes if I'm needed to do something? And I'm still learning that. I'll be learning that for the rest of my life, I'm sure. But I'm better now than I used to be. So every step is a little bit along the way. And it makes me aware of how hard it is for people to learn this stuff. You know, when I was younger, I used to think people will come into therapy and a few sessions, you know, they're sorted. Oh my God, you know, yes, they can be helped along a route and they can continue to work themselves. And I don't believe in long-term stuff, but in and out, come in and out when you need it. But for me, it's like, it's lifelong. The learning is lifelong. And it allows me to know that if, in my experience, that's how it is. So I imagine I'm not that unusual. I think that's probably how it is for most people. So yeah, there would have been an agreeableness, Sean, but I think at the bottom of all that, there is usually some negative feelings, maybe resentments or, you know, feeling hard done by, or maybe even depression and low mood, because I would certainly have experienced periods of that. And anxiety, you know, anxiety, which would always be associated with, did I do enough? Am I good enough? You know, that kind of thing, really, at its core. So, yeah.
Yeah, and in a way, like you spoke of some of the constraints, and you know, like everybody's life, I suppose, contains some element of these things that we're talking about, or other similar constraints or related things. But you spoke about it in one sense, that in one way it was a gift,
Yeah.
that, you know, our own particular situation or hang-ups or whatever sometimes can be used to an advantage in certain situations, or that, you know, the difference between maybe being on stage or being in a work environment or being in the home environment, maybe elements of civil there, you know, you could have maybe the stage personality, the home personality, the work personality. Maybe
Yes.
you could turn up for a particular performance, deliver that performance. Maybe you could lead, which you
Yes.
have done. So in a way, you're able to turn some of these things into an advantage or even a skill that enables you to perform very well out there in the world.
Yes, I would agree with you, Sean, to some extent, in the sense of being able to, yes, step into the roles that were there, you know, and having, when I think what I found really helpful was when I'm in a role, my duties, my structures are clear. I know what I have to do, and that reduces anxiety. It allows me to just do the job without worrying too much about it. But one thing I think, and a price that I recognize that I would pay if when I'm performing, is that it's not authentic enough. I'm still having to work really hard to maintain some kind of image that I feel is appropriate for that particular environment or for that particular place. And I think if I was to say what my work is, if you like, personal work is, it's all about authenticity. It's all about not having to perform anymore, you know,
Yes.
able to go in and out of roles, absolutely, for sure, but to go in and out of them easily because they're part of me. They're not me putting on a whole piece that I have to hide behind. It's actually more integrated than that. So that when I am being the psychologist, or I am being the mother, or I am being a friend, or whatever it is I am, whatever task I'm taking on, that it's actually more seamless moving between them, and it's not as anxiety provoking, because I think it's becoming more comfortable in my own skin and integrating all of those experiences that I have from our lives as a family, and from me personally as my own life, that, you know, I think that seems to be what the journey of life is about for me. It seems to be to become who you are. Literally, that poem that our grandmother wrote to her daughter, our mother, is exactly the mantra that I think I seem to be living out, you know.
Okay, so becoming who you are in the world, being comfortable with that, not apologizing for it, happy to be out there, be who you are, comfortable in your own skin is a goal. And as you say, maybe earlier generations may have figured that out for themselves as well in their own way. And
Yes.
maybe subsequent generations have to go through the same process and get there.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that, you know, that's the ultimate goal in a world that's very sophisticated now, very controlled in many ways, for people just to be freer, to be comfortable in their own skin, maybe not to have to conform so much, and to bring that diversity and that creativity that's in them, rather than suppress it, to bring it out and maybe gift it to the world, and that will all be the better for it.
I actually do think that. I think that there is actually a spiritual element to it for me, because I think that that aspect provides something extra that is not of the world, if you know what I mean, and is not bogged down in the structures that have been created in the world. Because I think you're right. I think there's very much a conformity and a competitiveness around, achieving some kind of status, some kind of recognition, some kind of wealth. And that seems to be what's being sold to young people a lot of the time as being the way to go. You need to get your qualification, you need to get, up in the world and get your house and get your car and get whatever material things you need to show the world how successful you are. And I think that what I'm actually happy to hear lately is a lot of young people saying, we were sold this is a lie. This is not where our happiness lies. So I think there may be the next generation are doing this a little bit sooner. Some of them. So I think sometimes for me, I can only speak for myself, is for me, I have found spiritually ways to actually find strength to stay developing and growing in a way that's not answerable to the structures of this world. It's more about our essence, if you like. We were created, we didn't create ourselves. We're here. We didn't really choose that, but we are here. And I think there's something ineffable about us. There's something beautiful about being here. Painful as well. And yeah, tragic and all that. But it's all a part of the same piece, I think. And I think that is more than anything that we can quantify or dissect. And to me, that kind of is our fuel, whether we know it or not, whether we're consciously thinking about it or not. Because if I was to think back on my life, there were times when things happened in a synchronicity way, in a synchronous way. I don't know what the word is, but anyway, yeah, in that way. Yeah. And I couldn't say how that occurred, but just that I really wanted something. And it's like I've heard it before, where the universe will help you to get it. If that's what you really want and you focus enough, you will get there somehow. And I feel I'm living proof of that. So I believe that. And I know that it wasn't purely on my own wits, if you like. It's and I think we are, it's like they say, you're standing on the shoulders of other people. We have our own generations past. We're this generation now, and we'll pass this on to our next generation. So I think we have the time. It's our time now. So yes, I do believe that to be who we are is actually the most important thing of all. Otherwise, what are we? We're just identikit humans, just following some kind of unthought about belief system that we become slaves to.
Yeah, I guess there's a uniqueness in every individual, and despite the fact that there are over 7 billion people in the world, there's not two of them the same. There's not two faces exactly the same. There's not two personalities exactly the same. And I guess if we bury that uniqueness that's in each of us, that's all we have really to bring to the world that's different, that's not there already.
That's right.
It's important to embrace that and let it out. And as you say, part of that is having the confidence to be yourself, to go out there in the world and bring to the world what you have to give.
Yes.
So in terms of, there seems to be, I suppose, more of a monoculture developing worldwide with globalization and big corporations spanning the globe and, media and everything, where the diversity of culture appears to be becoming less and less. And, you'll have one global language, one global legal system, one global business system, one global way of being. And that uniqueness that's in people tends to be buried a little bit. I'm curious as to how you view spirituality. For you, what does spirituality mean? Where does it come from? How do you incorporate it into your own life? And what does it do for you and for the world in general?
Okay. I would say that my experience of spirituality has changed as I've grown up. As I mentioned earlier, we had the Catholic Church growing up and its structures, and very much involved in that. I was, with regard to choirs and going to mass and attending all the sacraments and trying to be the good girl and do it all right. And if I did something wrong, I felt I was sinful and, you know, damned and all the rest of it, because we were taught in a way that was so judging. It was judging of us all the time. We were being told we were already stained. Once we were born, we had original sin. You know, we had already come in defective, if you like. So this was the message that we were given. And I honestly think, you know, I was speaking to somebody recently about this, and they talked about it as being spiritual abuse, because really it had that impact of putting so much fear into a child about what is actually about love. Essentially, that's what it's about. I think we're made as loving beings, but we're afraid of it. So over the years, I suppose I would have found, and I still am connected with that Catholic Church that I started with. I have issues with lots and lots of pieces about it. But to me, the community aspect and the singing, I love. And it's to me, they're interchangeable. Give me, and that, I know that might sound like heresy to some, but to me, it's all about, you know, trying to bring people together to realize we are all one. At one level, we are all in this together. And we are all like pieces of, you know, like a crystal. We're all like little bits of those fragments that make up the whole. And that's what makes us individually beautiful and yet collectively beautiful. So we're very important and we're very unimportant, actually, at the same time. That's the paradox. So I would have done some training years later on in soul making, it was called. So we did a lot of beautiful couple of years training there in spirituality and of a different kind. So spirituality that was connected to the earth, that was connected to rituals that Ireland used to conduct in pagan times, pagan spirituality, you know, such an oxymoron considered to be when I was growing up. But actually, you know, there's so much to learn from our ancestors around the rituals and the honoring of the earth and the seasons and the elements and all those things. And the belief that we were so interdependent, you know, the very thing that we're trying to achieve nowadays is the global, you know, warming and save our planet. It was all understood years ago. This is how people lived in sort of harmony with seasons and animals and all of that. So I did a couple of years training in that, and it involved dance and singing and using the body to actually, if you like, praise or to feel spiritually alive. You know, it wasn't about performing. It's just about letting that feeling of being alive be felt and expressed. And then for the last about 4 years, up to about last year, I was doing a course in, it was called Anam Cara, and it was a course in spirituality for people who are dying. And again, I was just, again, lucky enough to be advised about it by a friend, and I joined in, and it was just beautiful. So it's a guy called Richard Groves who comes over from the US, and he and John O'Donoghue, an Irish poet from Clare, you may have heard of him. He writes beautiful poetry. In fact, he would say, you know, when two people recognize each other, even if they've never met before, two Irish people, that say, oh, you were the next sod of turf to the sod that I was. I love that. We both came up from the earth somehow.
Very Irish thing, all right.
Yes, I recognize the sod of turf, yes.
Yeah, so there's a sort of, I suppose, what I'm hearing is that there's a kind of a disconnectedness now in the modern world where we're not as clued into nature and the environment and our own heritage, our own ancestry, where we come from.
Yes.
That we seem to be, maybe it's technology or maybe it's, you know, we move around more, or we're less involved in working with the land, working with nature. You know, it's a small percentage of the population now that would farm and do things like that.
Yes.
But in a sense, we've lost something. There's something very like that in Buddhism, I think, where we're seen, you know, more as part of the integrated whole that is nature, and that we come from it and kind of go back to it, and that the individual, as you say, is important on the one hand, but very unimportant on the other, that it's a part of that whole that makes up nature, and that the whole thing is kind of growing together or declining together, and you'd be a force for growth or decline within all of that.
Yes.
And that's sort of your spirituality, and trying to offload the Catholic guilt that, you know, you introduced.
Oh yes, yes, it's alive and well.
Still holding on to the best parts of that teaching and the community and the strength and the music and all of that.
Yes, I think one piece of it, just to say that what's in the whole is in the small piece. So to me, what we do internally has a huge effect on what happens externally. So our world, if you take the whole world, our whole world is contained in us, as well as it being out there. So I believe that the more we know ourselves, the more we choose to act out of love instead of fear, because they're the two strongest drivers, I believe. So the fear piece often is running the world, and even we can see it now with the pandemic. But the positive side of the pandemic is that people are have begun to connect a lot more and come back to nature a lot more, which is what we want. But I think if in our own lives, if my spirituality would be really based, if I was to bring it down to that, is it, am I acting out of love or am I acting out of fear? What am I motivated by?
Yeah.
And if I can constantly check in around that, and where possible, change it to love if I'm in fear, or if I'm in fear, hold back on whatever action I was going to do and wait until I can feel I can address that more in a loving way, whatever that is.
Yeah, you spoke earlier about, in a way, that we create our own reality, that what we think about, we get. And if we think about something positive or good, maybe we get that. And if we think about something negative or bad, maybe that's what we get. And that we're constantly creating our own reality, both as individuals and as a society and as a culture. And that maybe the world around us today is the world that we have collectively created.
Definitely, I would agree.
And fear, well, maybe we've got a fear-based world with nuclear missiles and silos and building walls and all this type of thing, where a love-based world maybe would be simpler, less competitive, and more sustainable. And that's kind of it seems a very kind of nature-based, maybe something that would have come down historically through previous generations to keep us connected with what's real and what's important.
I think so. I think that the problem we have is our ego. The problem we have is that our ego tells us we're more important. And we want to puff ourselves up a bit, you know, and be somehow separate from other people or different in some way. Better usually, or sometimes worse. You know, if we're in a bad place, we think I'm not as good as the rest. If we're in a good place, we think I'm better than the rest. But either way, the ego continually operates out of fear. And so, you know, if we really notice that I'm trying to be important, or I'm focusing on myself to more than I need to be, you know, then we can see, well, how can I be of help here? How can I be of help in this situation? Rather than, oh, I'm taking something very personally now and I'm offended or I'm upset. It's more about trying to help ourselves not to stay there. You know, things can happen and we all get offended and upset. We're all human. But it's a bit about taking responsibility for how we act in the world. So if people are being mean or being whatever, you know, I'm being very simplistic in my language, but if people, you know, are being unfair to each other or attacking each other in some way, and if we react in another attack, we're doing the same thing. We're actually just adding to that. You know, we're really not changing anything. Whereas if we can actually go, okay, I can see why they're attacking. I know that they're upset. I know that they've had whatever difficulties. It doesn't justify it, but I understand it. So I'm not going to be as impacted by it, and I'm certainly not going to react in anger to it. Now, that's a very, very simple but a very difficult way to live, particularly for oppressed people and people who are generally not getting a fair crack at the whip in our world at all. So I know what, yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. In a way, you're talking about, you de-escalate a situation, which is kind of the opposite of what we tend to see in the world today. So there's a de-escalation, there's an effort to maybe understand, and
Yes.
we have civil rights movements gaining momentum again, gaining traction, and Black Lives Matter and all of that, and we had that in this country as well. With the, when maybe Catholics were oppressed in the past in the North, and they had their civil rights marches that very quickly led on to violence, and you can sort of see that with the current movement as well. The ones who have really made a difference in the world are the ones who have stepped back from that violence, and Martin Luther King and Gandhi and people like that, who advocated peaceful resistance, and it seems to be the way forward, but seems to be almost superhuman for these people. Seem to be really special that can do that. You mentioned Nelson Mandela earlier on, and they've all made a huge impact on the world, but appear in some ways to be almost saintly, almost better than the average of what we see day to day out there.
I think that I would have read a good bit about Nelson Mandela, and I was fortunate to actually be in Cape Town and to visit Robben Island, where he was incarcerated all those years. And for part of his time, he did engage in violence. There was a period of time that he did do that. And he struggled with that because he felt that this was not how he wanted it to be. But there was a period, and this was held against him later on, for where he felt there was no other option. At one particular time when there was apartheid and all the things that were going on. But I think it's like what they say, it feels superhuman, and yet there are people right now, this minute, carers in their own house doing superhuman stuff. There's people everywhere doing this. It's just that they're not leaders of countries, or they're not standing in front of thousands. And that's the piece, I think, that it's great to have those role models. It's great to have people who have risen up in terms of bravery and courage and stood up for what they believe in through usually a lot of suffering. It's either great love or great suffering would usually bring them there. I follow Richard Rohr. He's a very interesting guy. He's a Catholic Franciscan priest in America, very forward thinking. But he would say that through great suffering or great love, we get into this place that we can actually, express who we really are, and that we can live in a way that actually adds something to the world. So there are people doing it all the time. There are people, sending out prayers for the world. And I believe that's an energy that lifts a kind of a vibration in the world that has an impact. So yes, I think there's the side of fear, which involves attack and separation. So we get the Russians, or we get the Chinese, or we get whoever we decide are our enemies, and we're afraid of them. So we have to gear up to fight, rather than maybe we're all in this together on one planet in the middle of this cosmos. It's not that big a planet in the scheme of things. It's actually minute. And if we were to really understand that, we might begin to realize we actually do need each other. And, everybody wants the same thing. Everybody wants their loved ones to be happy. Everybody wants their family to be well. People want the same thing at their core, And it's that if we could get to that and realize that the people we consider our enemies want the same things we do, that's it. So, yeah.
So in terms of, I suppose, the nature of our existence, I don't know to what extent our own mortality informs our day to day, or is it something we bury, we put away, we deny, that, that we are mortal, that we're here for a period of time, that all we really have is a period of time between the cradle and the grave, and that all of this material stuff and all of that didn't come into the world with us, won't leave the world with us. And then our place in the cosmos and our understanding of our own existence appears to be extremely limited. We try and come to terms with something that we don't understand and that is finite, and that we're here for a period of time, maybe to express ourselves in our own unique way and contribute to the overall consciousness that's there. And it seems to me that this is something that's worth fostering, and that in an ultra-competitive world, it's something that's maybe not valued to the degree that it should be. And that sometimes in societies or in conflicts, it's the more aggressive one that wins out and whose genes are passed on, and that we're here today because we're descendants of the ones who were tougher and survived, and maybe, or maybe part of us are the ones who made peace and managed to thrive and survive that way. I'm not sure to what extent we understand either ourselves or our own history or the history of the world. Sometimes it's written by the victors. Maybe some people who decided not to partake in a war or whatever, maybe their genes carried on because they didn't all die in a conflict or something. Maybe they walked away from that, and maybe there's a bit of that in us all as well. So there's a situation, I suppose, where we have a lot of power, we're important and we're not so important. And we have a lot of power for changing the world if we can bring ourselves to it. And that's been part of your journey, to discover that and to help it to grow and blossom and flourish. What do you think you want to bring to the world today, now at this stage in your life? What do you think you uniquely have to offer, or maybe not even uniquely, but maybe that you have to offer to bring some of those ideas to fruition?
Well, I suppose at some level I consider myself the eternal student of life. I'm constantly learning. So that would inform what I think I bring now. I'm looking at, I'm reading at the moment A Course in Miracles, which was written in the 70s actually, but it's fascinating. I'm really enjoying it. And it's very much about some of those themes that I've discussed around ego and fear and love. I've also had quite a scary illness recently, which kind of brought me to, thinking about, I may not survive this. And having done the training in living and dying, one of the pieces along that was that we face our own mortality, because as a culture, we don't tend to do that very well. We do the wake very well, but we don't get ready for it very well, or kind of think about it too much. But actually, it's liberating when you do, because, you're not so afraid of it anymore. It's almost like while you don't look at it, your fear grows. So if it's a bit like, I'm afraid of my own death. And they say that at the bottom of that is all your anxiety is based on that, really, annihilation. So, for me, there's a piece about in looking directly at it, in actually looking at your own death, it becomes something almost sweeter or something. It's hard to describe it, but it's something that almost makes you live more fully, because of the limitation of time. And of course, when, some religions believe that we have an eternal aspect to ourselves, people who don't buy that would say that's a great comfort, but it's a bit like taking, a Xanax or something. You've just kind of soothed yourself out of pain there. So these are some of the things that, I'm aware of. I like to think that we do have an eternal aspect to ourselves somehow. I don't know how, but I'd like to think that's true. So what would I like to give now? I think, there's a part of me was always kind of going, I'll get out of this psychology stuff now and I'll go into more of a spiritual type of ministry or something. And that's still there, I haven't actually done anything formally about it. So that's one possibility. Now that I have survived this recent bout, I feel okay, right? You're actually still here for a reason of some kind. So I feel more alive having come through that, actually, than I was before. So obviously I wasn't feeling great beforehand. So I'm back doing more psychology now, but I find that my spirituality informs a lot more of my work now. And it becomes a lot more about, it's not something I talk about overtly unless the person wants to, but I think that as the way of working, I find I'm more connected to people I meet now very, very quickly. I'm more tuned into them. I'm more able to help them without a big, long process. It happens much more organically and faster. So at the moment, that's what I'm doing. I'm continuing to work as a psychologist. I'm continuing to see people who've, for one reason or another, are not coping or have been through trauma. I've also done more studies in trauma work. And it was the one area I thought I wouldn't get into, you know, because I find it can be difficult, but I'm still drawn to it. So trauma can be lots of things. It needn't be involved in a bomb or involved in, you know, an accident. It can be trauma of losing a parent when a child. It can be the trauma of being abused sexually or physically or in any other way. And it can be anything that where we are out of control. We don't know what to do, you know, and we're left with that fear. So I love that aspect of what I do. I find it's, my ego would want me to be more important and, you know, out there somewhere doing a bit like some of our big respected people. But I know that what I do, when I do it from love and when I do it in the right way, that's all I need to do. I don't need to do any more. So I'll continue to do what I'm doing for now. I'll continue to find out more and more about spirituality and how that integrates with my psychology and see where it leads me, really, Sean. I don't have a concrete plan yet, but things seem to land in my inbox or on my laptop, or somebody mentions something whenever I need it. So I trust that. I really do. I don't go after things feverishly anymore. They seem to arrive when the time is right. So that's where I'm at, really.
Okay, so in terms of impact in the world, I suppose little things can grow and have a huge impact over time. It's like the butterfly flapping its wings in China creates a hurricane in the States or something. That
absolutely,
there's a lot of interconnectedness out there, and I suppose in so many people in the world now, and if you're one of 7 billion, you think, well, what impact can I have? How can I impact the great mass of humanity? And what you're saying is do it in your own small way, in your own community with the people that you work with. And that effect will ripple out there into the world and ultimately
absolutely
change everything, rather than trying to do it all, I guess, in a huge, big forum. That the small thing can be as equally as impactful.
Yeah, I think that's it, Sean. I think, first of all, if I was to summarize it, I think your relationship with yourself is the most important relationship you have, because you're with yourself for your whole life. So if you are treating yourself well, and if you learn over time, which we seem to have to learn, we seem to have to unlearn some things and learn some things. If we learn what it is to unconditionally love ourselves, that means, you know, if we make mistakes, not berating ourselves for making a mistake, saying, okay, you didn't get that one right. And in the same way as you would talk to a child, encourage in that inner voice, okay, we'll give it another shot. Now that takes practice. I don't always do it right. I don't always, you know, I'm not always as kind to myself as I could be. And I'm sure I'm not unusual in that either. But it is that determination or that willingness to try and treat ourselves with respect and with compassion and understanding. And then we cannot but put that out there. That's what we put out there. Mm-hmm. If we treat ourselves with judgment and fear, that's what we put out there. So it's to every person we meet in the day. It can be somebody you pass by in the street. If you're feeling loving thoughts towards them, that you're putting out there. Even if you only say hello or you nod your head, it doesn't actually matter. It's the fact that you, in your presence, are connected to that loving part of yourself. And that's your gift, in my opinion. So it can be in the smallest. And this is my piece, whenever I notice I'm becoming more attacking in my thinking. So I might see somebody that maybe said something or something happened before, and I might think, oh, there's that person, I wouldn't get on with them, or whatever. That might be my first thought. But as I read recently, you don't have to like people, but you have to love them.
Mm.
And that actually is it. Wishing them well, wishing them well. So I think if I am practicing and doing my work, then when I notice these kind of thoughts emerging about resisting somebody or pulling, that little bit of withdrawal or that little bit of, judging, that if I catch that when I'm at it, it's all about me. It's not about them at all. So here I am in my judging self, So once I catch her in flight, it's like saying, okay, hang on a second now. Wait now. Let's wish that person well. Let's send out healing, good wishes to that person. And in that, it neutralizes it straight away.
Yeah. So
it
it's
really
like the
does.
human condition, that we're not perfect, that we do make errors, that I suppose holding on to those errors, it's like, holding a grudge is like taking poison and expecting the other person to die. That,
Exactly.
we're
Yes.
really impacting on ourselves.
Yeah.
And that, going through our lives, I suppose the human condition is like that. None of us are perfect, but you develop that independence of spirit. You go back, you don't forget, but you forgive and you try again. And you acknowledge the fact that, we're human and we're fallible.
That's right.
And that ultimately, if you're coming from the right place, then I'm reminded of Wayne Dyer's quote. I think you get what you think about. It's like the law of attraction.
Yes.
If you think about something that you really, really don't want, you get that as well, because that's what you're focusing your attention on.
What you focus attention on. Absolutely, yes.
A lot of events are informed by, something bad happened somewhere in the world or to somebody or to ourselves, and that those things happen because, for reasons, and at times we're the ones that cause that to happen in someone else's life.
Yeah. Yes.
That to acknowledge that and to acknowledge the fallibility and go back and try again. And that's the human journey, I guess.
It is. And where we have made mistakes, if we can atone for that, if we can go back and apologize for that, be big enough to admit, I was wrong. I was wrong. I really acted badly there. And that's hard for us to do, when we're holding on to our righteousness or our whatever it is we think we have. It's to realize that they're no different than us. Everybody's the same. So there was a great practice that Pema Chodron, she's actually a Buddhist nun in America, well known, and she would talk about a practice of Tonglen. And Tonglen involves, I think it's a beautiful practice. So say if we're having a bad day, we've been really down or depressed or anxious or wound up or angry or whatever it is, if we decide to breathe in the anger in the world, now it sounds like the poison you talked about, it's nearly counterintuitive, right? You breathe in for all humanity. You say, okay, I'm carrying it right now. I'm carrying this emotion, whatever it is, and I'm willing to carry it for everybody for now. So you breathe it in. So now it becomes collective. Straight away, it's not just your little world and your self-importance. It becomes you willing to carry that peace for everybody. And when you breathe out peace. You want peace for everybody, including yourself. And by the same token, the opposite. If you're having a really happy time, you're really good form, everything's going well, that you breathe that in for the whole world, and then you breathe it out to share it. So in a way, that practice connects you to the bigger picture, connects you to the human race. So if you're really down and depressed, and that can feel very isolating and very lonely, when you breathe it in to share that depression, I'm having my depressed time. On behalf of every depressed person, I'm carrying my bit now. I can't do anything about it. I don't feel good. I'm breathing it in, and that allows me to realize everybody at the moment who is depressed right now is feeling the same. And I breathe out, wishing them well.
And when we look at the big hard things that have happened in the world, the genocides, the wars, is dissent from the group that's perpetuating that evil or creating that evil? Is it from within its own group that dissent should come? Because it seems to me that there have been situations in history where there's been a great evil imposed on populations, and that, you know, in trying to understand their response, I mean, they were facing, like you say, annihilation, which is our greatest fear,
Yeah.
or being forced to maybe try and defend themselves. And then you have a population on the side that's the aggressor, where they're either tacitly or intentionally supporting what's going on. And
Yeah.
should the dissent come from there, come from the aggressor side, because the other side is really being victimized, and they don't have the ability to
They don't have the power. Yeah.
yeah.
I think that with oppressed and the oppressor, there are two sides of the same coin. Whoever has the power to oppress may well use it. The oppressed person, they need a victim, or else they can't oppress, if you know what I mean.
Mm.
The people who are victimized carry a lot of pain and a lot of suffering and a lot of trauma. And I think one of the things that is helpful today is the notion of restorative justice, where people who have done harm to other people are brought to a place where they hear about the harm that they did, where the person whose the harm has been done against has an opportunity to tell them what it was like. And in that forum, it's far more effective than harsh judicial approaches, because you have human being to human being hearing the impact of their behavior on each other. And so when you're asking me, does the dissent come from within? I think both of those groups have their own work to do. It doesn't mean that one group has to do more than the other. Both of them are coming from places of, if you like, the aggressor is coming from fear. It's all fear-based. I'm afraid of these. I have to overthrow them. I have to quench them. I have to, you know, just overpower them in some way. And brutality and all of the awful things that are done, man's inhumanity to man, comes out there. So then you see, when if they get an opportunity in their lives to find themselves confronted with the impact of what they've done, and look at themselves and their actions and what influenced that, how did they get to that point where they could dehumanize another person because something in them is dehumanized in order to be able to do that. Can't do that unless you've already been harmed in some way, by whether you've been indoctrinated or whether you've had your own traumas as a child, or what has done it to you. But something has happened to influence you to be able to do that. And you see, as I believe at our core, we are made of love. I think all of us are. Some people wouldn't agree with me, but if you can help that person, the aggressor, to come back to who they really are, their humanity, then they would be as appalled. And it has happened many times at what they've done themselves. They would be appalled. And they have to then try and find a way to make up, to atone for their actions. Mm. And that could be doing good for the people who have been oppressed. It could be deciding, I'm going to now become, you know, somebody who champions support and aid for these people. I'm going to try and help them get back on their feet. I'm part of the reason that they're not, you know, I'm going to meet them personally and try and see, can I let myself feel the reality here of what's gone on, because it's painful to confront and to actually own, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's answering the question.
There's a bit of understanding there, that trying to understand the aggressor's mindset, where they're coming from. You know, I know in the early days with Hitler, for example, there was a policy of appeasement that was progressed by the British, and ultimately they were dealing with, you know, a situation or personality type or an organization that couldn't be appeased. But maybe understood a little bit better. And if it was understood a little bit better, maybe different approaches could have been tried.
Perhaps. It's a bit like bullying in the playground, you know? It's a bit like if you take it down to an individual level, because you see there's systems at work, and we're very susceptible as human beings to influence, you know, we really are. We talked about the Catholic Church earlier on in Ireland. You know, we were lucky enough to be born in a country that yeah, we did have that particular oppression, if you like, and lots of others, but we still had freedom to do something. We weren't totally, sat on. But I think that if you're in a country where the structures are much more rigid and heavy on top of you, then how can you develop to be the person that you want to be in the world? There's so many structural constraints on you and on your freedom, on everything. But it's like Viktor Frankl talked about, man's search for meaning, that even in the worst situations that he was in concentration camp, you still have your mind, you can still decide, how will I respond to this? But that takes a lot of strength, and it takes, when you're put to the wire, and he would have talked about other men in that camp who smoked their last cigarette, and then you knew they were going to die. They were holding on and holding on. They said, no, I can't go any further, and then they died. They literally gave up living. So it's a bit like, the human capacity. We don't know till we're put in a situation how we're going to be. None of us do, and it's like, actually, our dad used to say, every man is capable of doing, I'm capable of doing. That's what he used to say. And I remember as a child going, what? Well, wait, now, I don't think that's true now. You're, but actually I get it, we have to be humble enough to realize we could be that person. We could have been in Hitler's army. We could have been the aggressor in some kind of genocide. We don't know what we're capable of. Given if we were brought up in certain places, certain influences, we've no idea where we'd be. So there is that piece of understanding that while man has created this kind of world we're in, and it's a lot of it can be based on attack and division, that which part of me can attack and divide? Which part of me, is doing that in my life, here, right now? And how do I begin to address that? Because that's my contribution. It's really the only one I can make, is how do I ensure that I'm not adding to the fear in the world, that I'm not adding to and it might sound idealistic or not, naive, but I honestly don't think it is. I think it's actually our power. It's the power we actually do have. And when we exercise it, it has influence around us.
Yeah, so at the moment, I suppose there's things going on like, Black Lives Matter and things like that. And you sort of say, well, sometimes, what facilitates a great evil is not so much the ones carrying out that great evil, but it's the mass of people who, to all intents and purposes, ignore it or just don't get involved with it, look the other way, allow it to happen. So as an individual, there's both the internal work and what you put out into the world as well. And you sort of wonder that, in a situation where you have people protesting, people on the streets, stuff like that, it can kind of bring a violence out into the world that maybe wasn't there. But, on the other hand, they could work internally and change themselves, and by changing themselves, ultimately change the world. It's very hard to work out what the appropriate response is sometimes when there's an injustice out there. Are you one of the people that looks away, doesn't get involved with it? Are you one of the people that's out on the street protesting? Or are you a person that just in your own life is adopting principles that, of love rather than hatred, of inclusion rather than exclusion, and that in that way, in your own small way, you're trying to change the world maybe a little bit?
Yeah, I think ideally what is a challenge for us all is that we can do both. We can do our internal work and in some way contribute to the societal work, if you like. And that comes down, well, like, how do we vote? What do we vote for? Do we support places like, or people like Amnesty International, for example, or some of the big organizations in the world that are trying to equalize opportunities for people? We can do it in lots of ways. We can be activists to the extent that suits who we are and our personality. Not everybody is an activist. Not everybody is extrovert enough to want to engage at higher levels of discussion or discourse. But I think there is a challenge for us not to just be passive either. And I think that, if we if we really believe that our job here is to be who we are and to contribute to make the world a better place while we're here, then I think we will see opportunities. Whether it's a homeless person we pass on a street, what do we do? Do we stop? Do we say, how are you doing? Would you like a cup of coffee or a sandwich? Have you a place to stay? How are you getting on? And engage with that human being? Or do we walk past, as we, you know, as I've often done, walk past, maybe throw some coins into their cup, but not engage with them? Like, there's moments all the time, every day, for opportunities for us to treat another human being with ultimate respect. And so, you know, whether it's a one-on-one situation or whether it's joining a group that has actually is motivated to make life better, I think we can do both. I think to the extent that we can find whatever resonates with us as individuals, whatever group or whatever organizations we feel represent the values we hold, I think we can become that bit more active then, you know. And I think that's a good thing, because internal work is grand and very important. And like I say, I feel it's foundational and fundamental, but on its own, unless we behave differently in the world, it's all about me then otherwise. It's navel gazing, really. So I think it has to be extended. That's what we're here to do, I think. Extend out peace, and first of all, make sure we're trying to live it ourselves in the first place. Otherwise, it's a distorted peace we're extending out. It's not peace at all, really.
Okay, so like you said earlier, it's bring your light out into the world, and, you know, let it shine.
Yes.
Don't be afraid to do that and be who you are.
Absolutely.
It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Is there anything else you'd like to say in this forum before we leave it, or any message you'd like to put out there? Or are you happy enough to?
I think we've covered a lot of ground. I've enjoyed this morning very much, Sean. It's been really interesting, just to travel the life journey in the way that we did, and in the questions that you helped me to think through things that maybe I hadn't articulated fully before. Yeah, I think just, you know, I think all we can do is do our best and be who we are. I think that's I'll end with our grandmother's message: whatever you are, be that. That's it.
Okay, well, today we've had the wonderful pleasure of Mary Dwyer, as I say, a counselling psychologist, human being, life's journeys traveller like us all. So thanks again very much, Mary. It was a real pleasure having you on the podcast. And
thank you,
care.
Sean.
Okay.
Thanks a million. Bye-bye.
Bye now.